PEGI 18.
The following images on the screen are either going to be very, very familiar to you or something completely alien. But looking at them, what do you think they are? So we see a series of images, a series of descriptions. They're very straightforward. They use a set of clearly identifiable images and very, very stark black, white, and grey iconography as well, presenting to the audience a clear example of what content the product that they're buying contains. This is a form of regulation, and this regulation in particular applies to the video game industry. I'm Michael Collins, and this is Media Focus, and in this session we are going to be looking at the regulation of the video game industry. We're going to be thinking about the different types of regulation that the video game industry has, and we are also going to be considering through the theory of Livingstone and Lunt exactly how the video game industry is regulated and also what issues this throws up. And finally, we're just going to end on a couple of points and thoughts about how the Assassin's Creed series is regulated and exactly how effective this form of regulation is. So these images here are a form of content regulation which is set out by PEGI, or the Pan-European Gaming Information. These descriptors allow audiences and consumers to make informed choices about exactly what kind of game that they are going to be playing. And as we can see, these descriptions are much more prescriptive than pretty much any other form of media. We don't tend to see these kind of things on films unless the film is particularly extreme or the producer or distributor has decided to include some more in-depth content information. We can see here it gets very, very specific. So not only do we see things which might be fairly understandable, like violence or sex or something along those lines, we also have the extremely vague bad language there. Fear, which again is fairly vague and might manifest itself in lots and lots of different ways, and also gambling as well. Now, this allows audiences, most specifically parents, to make informed decisions about what video games their children may be playing. This also indicates something of the perceived target audience for video games, that even now it is considered that video games are a pursuit for children as opposed to adults, and that it is the adults who buy video games who are the consumers who need to make these informed choices about content before passing on the game to their children. So first of all, a little bit of history. Video game regulation in the UK was previously very spotty, and before ELSPA, or the Entertainment and Leisure Software Publishers Association, implemented their form of regulation in 1989, video games were basically just not regulated in the UK. Now, there was a kind of system of various different regulations. Sometimes, for example, if a game was particularly explicit, the publisher might choose to put for adults only on the box, but this was very, very much a form of self-regulation. And if you want to look at a couple of examples of controversial early video games, do check out the much, much longer video on the history of the video game industry. However, due to a number of reasons, it was considered to be very important to implement a form of consumer-based regulation to allow audiences to make decisions about what video games that they were going to play. So the most notable example of this in the UK was ELSPA, Entertainment and Leisure Software Publishers Association. So again, implemented in 1998. And if you are my age, then you will remember these, not age certificates, but these regulatory guidelines being on video games. And as we can see here, it's fairly similar to the BBFC regulation system, with a series of ages with different ticks. Sometimes the ELSPA guidelines would go even further and also provide more detailed content regulation and examples of content that, for example, that we saw in the previous slide. Things changed a little bit in 2003 with the introduction of the PEGI, or Pan-European Game Information System. Once more, this is a European system, and once more, this is a regulation system which is advisory as opposed to being legally binding. So this is something which is different from the BBFC. And this is something which is very, very important to point out. However, as we can see, the guidelines, the levels of information which are provided are actually very, very similar to the information which is provided by the BBFC. So we have a series of ages there, 3, 7, 12, 16, 18. Very similar, although not exactly the same as the BBFC's system. And PEGI are clear to point out that these guidelines here are not about how difficult the game is, or not about even particularly how suitable these games might be for younger audiences, but they relate to content which may cause harm or offence or distress to younger audiences. And if we take a little look at the content descriptors underneath the age labels, we can see that it goes into even more depth than we've seen previously. There's also a content descriptor for discrimination, so potential racist language and themes of racism and discrimination. We also see a content descriptor for drugs as well as things like gambling, fear, bad language, sex and violence that we've already looked at previously. Not only does this indicate that the video game industry, at least at a consumer level, is regulated to a fairly substantial degree, it also indicates the fact that video games are far more adult, or can be far more adult, than a lot of parents do consider. And the idea behind the PEGI system is that it will allow parents in particular to make informed decisions about what kinds of video games their children play. However, PEGI isn't the be-all and end-all. There is no obligation for video games in the UK to actually hold a PEGI symbol on them. And it's really important to point this out. There is no obligation for shops and distributors of video games to actually follow up on the PEGI rules, which leads to some interesting circumstances. Now, in the United Kingdom, any shop can refuse service to anybody for any reasonable means. And this may well come into force under the PEGI system. For example, if a 12-year-old comes into a shop and tries to buy a copy of Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, for example, which is designated a PEGI 18, well, the shopkeeper can choose to not give the video game over to this person. However, they are under no legal obligation to do so. This is an advisory system. But things get a lot more confusing than this. So just a couple of examples up on the screen at the moment. On the left, we have the video game Resident Evil 2, which was released in the mid-90s, I think 1999. 1998 for the PlayStation 1. And on the right, we have Silent Hill, which was released in 1999 on the PlayStation 1. And one thing we'll notice is that Resident Evil 2 has a BBFC age certificate. So this kind of throws everything which I've just been talking about right out of the window. Why is it that Resident Evil 2 has a BBFC age certificate? Now, previously, the BBFC would in some cases regulate video games in the UK if they had what we call FMV, or full motion video in it. This is to say, actual video of actual people. And to my knowledge, the first game to be regulated by the BBFC in the UK and to get an actual BBFC age certificate was the game The Seventh Guest, released by Trilobite on the PC in 1993. And that game got a BBFC 15 certificate. Other notable games to get BBFC certificates early on include Night Trap, which was released for the Sega Mega CD in 1994. But not every game which gets a BBFC certificate has FMV, and this all gets rather confusing very, very quickly. The reason why I wanted to bring up these two examples is about the content of these two games. So on the left, we have Resident Evil 2, which is a zombie survival horror game. Now, the game is very violent, the game is very gory, and it's probably for these reasons that the BBFC decided to intervene and to give it a BBFC 15 certificate. However, arguably, the game isn't actually particularly disturbing. It's all very silly. There are huge spiders and massive crocodiles, and I guess things get a little bit creepy at times, and of course it is very, very gory. But I don't really think, unless you are very young, that it's likely that Resident Evil 2 is going to give you nightmares. Correct me if I'm wrong there. On the right, however, we have Silent Hill, which is unfortunately a franchise which has been pretty much abandoned by its developer, Konami, although I do hear it might be coming back very soon. One interesting thing about Silent Hill is that it is absolutely terrifying, and not in a way of things exploding and blood spilling everywhere and stuff like that. Silent Hill and the entire Silent Hill series are a series of psychological horror games. They focus on the horror of the mind, and they do things in order to upset and play with the audience's expectations of a video game. Silent Hill has many adult themes about sex, sexualization, about violence, and about mental health, which are extremely adult and quite nightmarish, and definitely scarred me as a young person, as we'll go into in just a second. However, it's very notable that despite the fact that these games were released at roughly the same time in the UK, i.e. 1998, 1999, one of them, Resident Evil 2, got a BBFC certificate, and Silent Hill, on the other hand, which contains strong psychological horror, got a PEGI, or rather an ELSPA rating of 18 plus. Now, this leads to some interesting situations. So just to draw on my own experience of these two games, I went into WH Smith in Kings Lynn with a gift voucher for my birthday, and I bought a copy of Silent Hill. Now, how old was I at the time? I was 13. And there were absolutely no problems. The person in the shop didn't even bat an eyelid, handed over my gift voucher, took the game home, and I was absolutely traumatized. I would definitely recommend checking out Silent Hill if you do get the opportunity to do so. But it is pure nightmare fuel, and it's very, very much something which my 13-year-old brain just couldn't handle at that time. It is absolutely terrifying and is completely based on many, many adult ideas. And also, things like the fact the game is almost completely set in the dark, and, all these themes of the main character losing his mind, and the absolutely amazing industrial noise soundtrack as well. Fantastic stuff, but very, very scary. Did actually give me nightmares for a series of months. Resident Evil 2, on the other hand, gave me absolutely no problems at all. It's a laugh. It's quite silly. Several bits made me jump quite a lot, but, it didn't give me any nightmares, despite, also being 13, I think, when I bought it. However, Resident Evil 2 was significantly harder for me to buy. Going into a shop called, what was it even called? Electronics Boutique, also in Kings Lynn, back in 1999 when I bought this. Essentially, I had to beg the person in the shop in order to sell it to me because I wasn't 15. My expert ruse was, I'm 15. No, really, I am. I've forgotten my ID. Eventually that went through and I was able to get the game. And technically the shop were breaking the law. So sorry about that, Electronics Boutique, although you did close down many, many years ago. So we have this issue here. The one game, of course, was significantly harder for me to get hold of than the other game, which there was no legal restraints on at all. But another really important thing to consider is because I was quite tall, and because I really wanted this game and I, just ended up begging for it, I was able to get hold of Resident Evil 2 regardless, despite the fact it was a BBFC certificate game. And to be quite honest, if they didn't sell it to me, I would have just asked my mum to go into the shop and buy it for me. So absolutely no way that was going to stop me from getting it. So This raises some very, very important issues about regulation. Now, just so we're all on the same page here, regulation refers to the rules and restrictions that a media product must follow. And regulation comes in many, many different forms, as we have seen. In some cases, regulation is strict. The BBFC age restrictions in the UK are some of the most strict regulations of films in the whole world. In most other countries, they do not have these strict regulations. However, even in the UK, we can subvert these regulations. Now it is much, much easier to do so. So the theorists we're looking at now is this idea of regulation, and this is most excellently explored by Sonia Livingstone and Peter Hunt. And just to sum up their theory in a nutshell, this increasing power of global media corporations, together with the rise of convergent media technologies and transformations in production, distribution, and marketing of media, have placed traditional approaches to media regulation at risk. Now, what does this actually mean? Let's just pop through this. Let's just pop through these ideas of regulation now. So first of all, there are a couple of types of regulation. I'm not going to go through all of Livingstone and Lunt's regulation, but I'm just going to, just bring up a couple now. So first of all, we have this idea of consumer-based content regulation. Consumer-based content regulation is a form of regulation which exists to tell the consumer or the audience about what kind of content the game or film or TV show or music video or whatever has in it. This is in order to help audiences to make informed choices about what it contains. So the best example of this right now would be PEGI, the Pan-European Game Information. So this is literally off PEGI's Wikipedia page. Pan-European Game Information, PEGI, is a European video game content rating system established to help European consumers make informed decisions when buying video games or apps through the use of age recommendations or content descriptors. So this is not a form of regulation which is seeking to stop people from buying stuff and to view stuff necessarily. Although shops can use it as a form of regulation. And for example, W.H. Smith and King's Lynn could have definitely not sold me Silent Hill. And if they'd had a look at that age certificate, they might have looked at the 13-year-old in front of them and thought, nah, this is too much for him. But they didn't, and they gave me nightmares. So, yeah. So this form of regulation exists to make consumers, such as myself and such as you, make decisions when we buy video games, when we buy films or whatever. So we can look at the descriptions and we can choose exactly what to buy. We can choose exactly what's going on. Another form of regulation is much more vague, and this is self-regulation. And self-regulation, as you might kind of understand from this term, is where an industry, is where a provider, is where a service, is where a distributor, a producer or whatever regulates themselves. An excellent example of this would be the code of conduct that YouTube follows. Now, YouTube regulates itself. Now, there are other forms of regulations which might kind of step in if YouTube goes far too far. For example, the BBFC or the Advertising Standards Agency in the UK. But by and large, YouTube is based in America. Its servers are based all around the world, but it is based in a completely different country. So it has a completely different form of regulation. So this completely goes over the head of traditional forms of regulation. YouTube's regulation is, sorry to insult you, YouTube, is absolutely bonkers. The things you can and can't do are completely the opposite of what we might expect in the UK. For example, pretty much any form of sex or nudity is basically outlawed unless you are a large channel and you can get away with it. So there are huge exceptions to this. However, and also kind of any form of extreme violence is generally dismissed. However, there are many, many examples of channels which do host this kind of stuff. So generally this is done on a case-by-case basis. It is extremely ineffective. Now, one form of regulation that YouTube does implement is this idea of age-restricted videos. But as you guys all know, as I know, as everybody knows, it is so easy to watch an age-restricted video. How do you get beyond this exceptionally powerful form of regulation? You just click on the box saying, I am 18. There we go. And the reason why they even have such a flimsy form of regulation is in order to mitigate any blame or any responsibility. Essentially, let's just say I'm 13, I pretend I'm 18, I watch a video, I get scarred. It's not YouTube's fault. It is me as the consumer. So this is a form broadly of self-regulation. Another excellent example of self-regulation in the UK is IPSO, which is a very, very vague form of regulation of UK news media, who essentially, as we have seen or will see in the newspaper industry module, completely break these rules all the time. So, this is one of the points of Livingstone and Lunt, the fact that there are different forms of regulation and there are different reasons for regulation. So rather than just stopping people from seeing stuff, this idea of consumer-based content regulation is in order to make adult consumers primarily make informed decisions about what they and what their children are going to watch. And to be quite honest, this seems quite reasonable to me. There's another really, really important thing, though, that we need to consider for regulation of the media industries. And this is the fact that the effective regulation of media products is now largely impossible due to digitally convergent technologies. Let's just think about this for a second. Let's just take us all back in time to 1998. So 1998, 1999. This was roughly the time when I was buying these games. And if I went into the shop and they said, nope, you can't buy this, you're clearly not 15 and you do not have any ID, well, I could try and get my mum to buy it for me, but let's just say she was a good mother and she said, no, you're not having it. It's way too gory. You can have it in a couple of years when you're 15. But mum, I would say, I want this game now. But of course, that would hold absolutely no truck. The argument would be over, and that's all I could do. Let's fast forward, however, 20 years roughly to the time of now. Let's just say you can't get hold of a game. Let's just say you're not old enough to get hold of a game. Now, what other options are available to you now? Now, I don't want to get into this too much for legal reasons, but one option that might be available to you is piracy. So you can completely sidestep any form of legal regulation by utilizing illegal piracy, by, for example, using a torrent service or a Wares service or a direct download service, such as, I won't mention them just in case my account gets suspended. And I'm not going to go into details about, how this is actually possible. But quite frankly, you guys, anybody with just a teeny little bit of knowledge, probably just Googling it, could get hold of pretty much anything, including illegal content, now within seconds. So that's something now which is extremely important to realize. And although you guys have all grown up in a world where this is very much the case, so it's not exactly, new news to you. However, this is a massive challenge for the regulation of media industries. So just as a little experiment, I tried to access the torrent site, the Pirate Bay. A torrent is a way of distributing information which is shared by a number of users using a torrent client. And this allows a number of files, both legal but also illegal, to be shared in effective ways, which would normally not be permissible in other circumstances. That's a very, very quick and dirty explanation of what torrenting is. So I searched for the Pirate Bay on my computer, and this happens. Sorry, this page is not available through Virgin Media. Well, thank you very much, Virgin Media, for censoring my internet search. So already we do have a form of regulation, which is stopping me from getting there. However, I won't show you the process, obviously, because it would be illegal. But within, I think, 4 seconds after seeing this screen, literally, I was able to get to this screen. I was able to actually find the Pirate Bay. And from this screen, I could then type into the search bar and I could basically torrent, I could download pretty much anything that I wanted to, as long as some kind pirate has uploaded it. So obviously we have issues of legality, we have issues of ethics. One of the main reasons why media is regulated to such a degree is the ideas of intellectual property and copyright. It's the idea of taking somebody else's property. It's the idea of taking somebody else's revenue stream. So if I pirate, if I download a game like Resident Evil 2, for example, I am stopping the publishers Capcom from getting the revenue. But there's also another issue that is risen through this, and that's the fact that by downloading something illegally, by accessing something illegally, I am not going through the traditional regulatory routes. So this is a really, really big issue. But also, let's just take a think about legal forms of distribution. So let's just say, again, I'm 13 and I want to play Assassin's Creed. Okay, many of the Assassin's Creed games are PEGI 18. So obviously that's not a particularly effective form of regulation anyway, but let's just say I can't get hold of it in my hometown because no one's going to sell it to me. Well, how can I bypass this regulation? Well, quite simply, I can go onto the PlayStation Store or the Xbox Store, whatever that's called, or I can go onto another digital distribution service such as Steam, and I can just download it. And there is no restriction on this. There's probably a box that I need to tick saying that I'm 18 and that I understand that this game might have adult content or something along those lines. That generally is something that happens. But again, this is something which is designed to waive responsibility on behalf of the distributor. So even if I am not going to break any rules or laws, and guys, don't break the law. Just really important points to point out there. But even if I don't break the law, I can still access this game even if I'm not old enough. I can still access this game even if the themes and content and stuff within this game might actually cause me harm or offense. This is something else that we need to consider for regulation, is why are video games regulated? Why is any form of media regulated? And one of the reasons for this comes down to this idea that media products have an effect on audiences. So this is very much related to Albert Banduras's effects model, this idea that media products have a direct effect on us. And even beyond Bandura, if we look at somebody like Stuart Hall, for example, in his reception theory, we can still see that media products can affect us in different ways. So regulation is important. It is important that certain media products are kept out of the hands of certain people. That, is fairly clear. An extremely violent game or a game with, lots and lots of sexual content, or a game which deals with, very adult themes, issues, for example, depression and things like that, as many games do. These ideas are probably going to be way, way too much for younger or impressionable audiences. And there needs to be some form of regulation to stop this happening. However, according to Livingstone and Lunt, due to digital technologies and this idea that we can bypass the traditional forms of accessing media, this form of regulation is largely ineffective. And I just want to draw attention to this slide right here, because this is something you can repeat for any industry that you explore in media studies. The regulation of every industry is ineffective. Absolutely every industry. So that is essential to consider. So just to conclude, I'm going to do this very, very vaguely now. And, I'm not really going to giving many answers here, but I think, This is just, something I want you to consider, and this is something that you can research as well. Considering the Assassin's Creed series, well, what regulatory issues are raised for this series? Well, for one thing, the series is basically based on this idea of murder and assassination. It's this idea that murder is acceptable in order to further a political or a social goal. And this idea, although it may not seem so extreme compared to some of the stuff that we've been looking at, is perhaps reinforces certain ideological worldviews. The game series is also very violent, and there are often violent scenes within the game, often in quick succession as well. And a game like Assassin's Creed is way more violent than the vast majority of films. If I think about a game from the series, certain games in the Assassin's Creed series have been given BBFC ratings, certain games have been given PEGI ratings, and what this suggests is that the regulation of the video game industry in the UK is largely ineffective. It is confused. There is no real rhyme or reason why one form of regulation is used for some and one form of regulation is used for the other, and quite frankly, this can only cause confusion in consumers. So one thing we need to do is we need to consider exactly how effective is the PEGI rating in creating informed decisions for consumers. My response to that would be, well, not very at all, especially if this is completely undermined by the BBFC stepping in for completely arbitrary reasons for certain video games. How effective is the regulation of the Assassin's Creed series? Well, not very. That's the answer to everything we look at. You can easily get hold of any of these games through digital distribution services, regardless of how old you are. Does it effectively stop younger and impressionable audiences from playing the games? No. You can either get hold of the games through legal or illegal means, but age is absolutely no barrier to this. What is the implications of this? Well, at the risk of sounding like a broken record here, the implications of this is that the regulation of the video game industry in the UK is completely and utterly ineffective.